Anderson Cooper has spent 30 years of his life asking the kinds of questions most people are afraid to ask. He has sat across from dictators, spoken with war criminals, listened to grieving families, and interviewed some of the most powerful individuals in the world. But one Sunday evening turned out to be completely different from anything he had experienced before. That day, sitting across from him was a duchess so certain of her own perspective that she didn't realize how, with every answer she gave, she was slowly putting herself in a difficult position. Meghan Markle walked into the interview expecting something very different. She believed she would receive soft, understanding questions. She assumed this would be a platform where she could calmly present the points she had carefully prepared in advance. But what she received instead was something else entirely. She faced precise and focused questioning, a calm but firm approach that slowly began to reveal inconsistencies, and a process where each answer only made things clearer and more uncomfortable. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, something happened that rarely happens. Anderson Cooper ended the interview before it was finished, and asked the Duchess of Sussex to leave. The footage from that moment would be replayed again and again. And the impact of that interview would last far longer than the clip itself. But before we go deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Every week, we bring you the most shocking moments from the world of media. Now, let's look at what really happened inside that interview room. The 60-minute setup was intentionally simple. 2 chairs facing each other. Soft lighting. Cameras carefully placed to capture even the smallest expressions. There was no audience. No applause. No distractions. Just 2 people, and the truth that would slowly unfold between them. Meghan Markle entered the room with an entourage that seemed unusually large for a taped interview. There were handlers, publicists, a personal assistant, and even a media consultant quietly giving last-minute instructions. Anderson watched silently as they adjusted everything around her, her seating position, the lighting, even the placement of her water glass. After a few moments, they stepped out, leaving the room. Now, only 2 people remained. Anderson Cooper and Meghan Markle. And the cameras watching them both. Meghan sat down with a posture that balanced vulnerability and control at the same time. It was the kind of presence you see in someone trained to appear relatable while still maintaining authority. "Thank you for doing this," Anderson said, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you for having me," Meghan replied. But there was a slight tone in her voice, something that suggested she wasn't just participating, she was allowing it. Before beginning, Anderson spoke clearly. "Before we start, I'd like to set a few ground rules. I'm going to ask you questions. Some will be easy, some will be difficult. My job is to get honest answers. Your job is to give them. Fair?" Meghan's smile tightened slightly. "I'm always honest. That's the point of everything I do," she said. "Good," Anderson replied calmly. "Then we shouldn't have any problems." The cameras began rolling. Anderson leaned slightly forward, relaxed, but focused. "Let's begin with where you are now. You've been living in California for several years. You've built a new life, started projects, and established a foundation. How would you describe this phase of your life?" Meghan nodded, appearing comfortable with the question. "This phase is about freedom," she said. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm making my own decisions. I'm living on my own terms. It's been very liberating." Anderson followed up gently. "Liberating from what?" She answered, "From the pressure of the institution, from constant scrutiny, and from expectations that didn't reflect who I truly am." Anderson nodded slowly. Then he asked the next question, the one that quietly began to shift the tone of the interview. Anderson paused for a moment, then asked calmly, "You mentioned constant scrutiny, but if we look at it, you've actually received more media coverage after leaving the royal family than you did while you were part of it. Netflix documentaries, podcast deals, multiple interviews." He looked at her carefully. "So how do you reconcile wanting less scrutiny, while actively using more platforms?" This was the first moment where Meghan's expression shifted slightly. There was a brief hesitation in her eyes, then she responded. "There's a difference between scrutiny and storytelling. I'm not being scrutinized now. I'm choosing to share my story." Anderson didn't interrupt. He simply nodded slightly, as if absorbing her answer. "But the end result is the same, isn't it?" he said calmly. "Your life is still being examined, discussed, analyzed. The only difference is who controls it." Meghan replied directly, "The difference is consent. I consent to this. I didn't consent to tabloid intrusion." Anderson leaned forward slightly. "Fair enough. But even with consent, scrutiny is still scrutiny. You've invited millions of people into your life through your own projects. Can you really object to attention when you've actively created it?" This time, Meghan's jaw tightened visibly. "I'm not objecting," she said, her tone sharper now. "I'm explaining the difference between wanted attention and unwanted attention." "Exactly," Anderson said quickly. So where does this interview fall? Wanted attention? Of course, she replied. I'm here voluntarily. And if I ask you difficult questions, questions you may not want to answer, is that still wanted attention? Meghan paused for a second. That depends on the questions, she said. Anderson replied immediately. I think it depends on the answers. Let's find out. That was the moment the tone fully shifted. Anderson adjusted slightly in his seat, a subtle signal that the warm-up phase was over. Let's talk about your struggles, he continued. You've spoken about mental health challenges, isolation, and hostility from the institution. These are serious claims, and they deserve serious attention. He paused briefly. But I want to ask you something that might be uncomfortable. Meghan sat a little straighter. Go ahead, she said. You've attributed much of your suffering to the institution, the palace, the press. He maintained eye contact. But you chose to enter that world. You pursued a relationship with a prince, knowing what the royal family represents. Then the question came directly. How do you reconcile presenting yourself as a victim of something that you willingly chose? The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Meghan's expression hardened. No one can fully understand what they're stepping into until they're inside it, she said. Anderson nodded slightly. That's true in many situations, he replied. But you were an adult. You had access to information. You had experience in the public eye as an actress. He leaned forward slightly. So the idea that you were completely blindsided feels incomplete. Meghan responded firmly. I was blindsided by the cruelty, by institutional hostility, and by racism. The word racism landed heavily in the room. Anderson didn't hesitate. You've mentioned racism multiple times. Can you be specific about what happened? Meghan's tone cooled immediately. I've already spoken about this. I'm not going to relive every painful moment for your audience. Anderson stayed calm. I'm not asking you to relive everything, he clarified. I'm asking for specifics about a very serious claim. He continued, clearly and directly. You've implied that someone in the royal family made remarks about your son's skin color. But you've never named who said it, or what exactly was said. He paused briefly. That leaves everyone under suspicion. Is that fair? Meghan answered quickly. I chose not to name the person to protect them. Anderson responded just as quickly. You protected one person, but placed suspicion on everyone else. Now the entire family is under question. Is that a better outcome? There was a brief silence. Meghan spoke more slowly this time. My intention was to preserve relationships. Anderson shook his head slightly. Publicly accusing a family of racism without naming anyone doesn't preserve relationships. It damages all of them. He continued, calmly but firmly. Now every individual wonders if they were the one you meant. Everyone feels accused. Then he added another layer. Vague accusations also have another effect. They can't be disproven. They can't be directly addressed. And they stay in the public mind for a long time. He looked directly at her. That kind of accusation can be very useful for controlling a narrative. That line clearly hit. Meghan's composure began to crack. You're doing exactly what the British press did, she said. You're questioning my credibility instead of engaging with my experience. Anderson didn't react emotionally. I'm doing what any journalist does when faced with serious claims, he said calmly. I'm asking for evidence. He paused briefly. That's not an attack. That's journalism. Then he added something important. And if questions feel like attacks, that's worth examining. Meghan responded sharply. Your questions have an agenda. Anderson replied without hesitation. My agenda is clarity. I want to understand what happened, and why. He continued, slightly more firm now. You've made public accusations that have global consequences. The reputation of the British monarchy has been affected. Relationships have been strained. Then the key line. And all of this is based on claims you won't substantiate. I'm asking you to substantiate them. Meghan replied, I don't owe you that. Anderson answered calmly. You don't owe me anything personally. But you chose to make these claims publicly. He leaned slightly forward. And public claims invite public scrutiny. You can't ask to be believed, while refusing to provide details. Meghan shifted in her seat, briefly starting to stand, then sitting back down again. It was a small movement, but it showed growing tension. Can we change the subject? She asked. Anderson nodded. Of course. Then he asked the next question. How's Harry? And just like that, the conversation took another sharp turn. The moment Anderson asked, How's Harry? The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Meghan's expression, which had already become defensive, now completely closed off. It was as if a wall had gone up in an instant. I'd prefer not to discuss my husband, she said directly. Anderson raised his eyebrows slightly, not dramatically, just enough to show surprise, while keeping his tone calm. But he's central to your public story, he replied. Your relationship, your decision to leave royal life, your shared experiences, all of that has been presented as a joint journey. Then he asked the obvious question. How do we talk about your journey, without talking about him? Meghan answered. We can talk about my individual experience. Anderson followed immediately. What is that individual experience? There was a brief silence in the room. He continued, carefully but directly. Everything you've shared publicly includes Harry. The Netflix documentary, both of you. The decision to step away, both of you. Your foundation, both of you. He looked at her steadily. So what exactly is your experience, separate from that? Meghan paused. But this time, she didn't have a clear answer. Anderson softened his tone slightly, but not the question. I'm not trying to trap you, he said. I'm genuinely asking. You've presented yourself as part of a team. If that team is removed from the conversation, what remains? Meghan responded, her tone sharper now. I have my own identity. Anderson nodded. I'm sure you do, he said. But you haven't shown it publicly. He continued, calmly but firmly. Everything the public knows about your life after the royal family involves Harry. So when you say you don't want to discuss him, what you're really saying is that you don't want to discuss your public life. Meghan's tone hardened further. My relationship is private. For the first time, a faint smile crossed Anderson's face, not mocking, just noticeable. Private, he repeated gently. Meghan, you shared your relationship in a 6-hour Netflix documentary. You spoke about your marriage in detail during the Oprah interview. He continued, listing examples. You discussed personal conversations, private moments, family conflicts. Then the key question. So where exactly is the privacy? Meghan replied. I decide what I share and when. Anderson nodded. Of course you do, he said. But once something is made public, you can't later claim parts of it as private when they become uncomfortable. Then a firm line. When you present your story to the world, you don't get to take back the parts you no longer want discussed. The tension in the room was now obvious. Meghan looked visibly uncomfortable. Anderson remained calm, but his questions were becoming sharper. He shifted the topic. Let's talk about your projects, he said. The Netflix deal, the Spotify podcast, the ventures you've announced. He paused slightly. How are those going? Meghan's expression flickered, perhaps irritation, perhaps concern. It's going well, she said. We're doing important work through our foundation. Creating meaningful content that makes a difference. Anderson asked immediately. Can you be specific? What content have you produced? Meghan replied. We've done documentaries, the podcast. Anderson stepped in. The podcast that ended after one season. The room seemed to tighten. The one where a Spotify executive referred to you as grifters. Meghan's face flushed slightly. That was one person's opinion, she said. Anderson corrected her calmly. That person was the head of podcasting at Spotify. Then he added. And his opinion seemed to reflect the company's decision, since your deal ended early. Then the question. What went wrong? Meghan answered. Our visions didn't align. Anderson leaned forward slightly. Your vision was to be paid millions while producing minimal content, he said evenly. Their vision was to receive consistent content for their investment. He paused. That difference would create tension. Meghan reacted quickly. That's an unfair characterization. Anderson responded just as directly. Is it? Then he brought in the numbers. You signed a deal reportedly worth $20 million. You produced 12 podcast episodes over 3 years. He paused for emphasis. That's fewer than 4 episodes per year. Then he added the comparison. Most podcasters produce 4 episodes per month. Then came the direct question. What were you doing with the rest of that time? Meghan replied. We were being thoughtful about the content. Quality over quantity. Anderson answered immediately. Quality still requires output. Then a blunt line. What you delivered was very limited. He added calmly. And the company that paid you clearly agreed, based on how the deal ended. Meghan's voice rose slightly. You don't understand the pressures we were under. Anderson asked directly. What pressures? Then he laid it out. You were being paid millions. You had creative control. You had resources. Then the key question. What exactly prevented you from producing the work you were paid to produce? This time, Meghan didn't have an answer. There was a noticeable silence. Anderson continued. Then there's Netflix, he said. Several projects were recently cancelled, the animated series, documentary concepts. He looked at her. What happened there? Meghan answered carefully. Projects evolve. That's how the industry works. Anderson replied calmly. Evolve is a generous word for cancelled. Then he pointed out the pattern. Spotify deal ends early. Netflix projects get dropped. He paused. At what point do we stop blaming the companies and start asking whether the issue might be the product? That line landed hard. And this was the moment everything started to break. The moment Anderson said, maybe the issue is the product. Meghan suddenly stood up from her chair. The movement was so abrupt that even the crew members in the room were caught off guard. This is exactly what I expected, she said, her voice controlled but clearly filled with anger. Another interview pretending to be journalism, when it's actually just an attack. Anderson remained seated. He simply looked up at her, his expression calm, almost curious. Which question was an attack? He asked. Then, one by one, he began listing them. I asked about your experience, you said you were blindsided. I asked for specifics about racism, you declined. I asked about Harry, you said it was private. I asked about your projects, you blamed external factors. Then he looked directly at her. At what point did any of that become an attack? Meghan responded immediately. Your tone. Anderson nodded slightly. My tone is calm, professional, and consistent, he said. It's the same tone I use with everyone. Then he added something sharper. If it feels hostile to you, it may be worth asking why basic questions feel that way. Meghan fired back. You're not asking questions. You're prosecuting. Anderson replied without raising his voice. I'm asking you to explain statements you've made publicly. That's not prosecution, that's accountability. Then he made a broader observation. And this is something I've noticed in many of your interviews, any question you don't like becomes an attack. Any scrutiny becomes persecution. He paused briefly. That may be an effective defense, but it's not honest engagement. Meghan picked up her water glass, then set it back down without taking a sip. I don't have to justify myself to you, she said. Anderson nodded. No, you don't owe me anything personally, he replied. But you agreed to be here. This is 60 minutes. Then a firm statement. We don't do soft interviews. We ask real questions. He held her gaze. If you were expecting something easier, this was the wrong place. Meghan responded sharply. I wasn't expecting soft treatment. I was expecting fair treatment. Anderson answered immediately. This is fair. Then he defined it clearly. Fair means I ask real questions, and you provide real answers. He continued. So far, you've given deflection, resistance, and claims you won't support with details. Then the blunt line. That's not my failure. That's yours. Meghan turned and began walking toward the door. She reached near the exit, then stopped. Slowly, she turned back, clearly not ready to let the moment end like that. You know what I've noticed about journalists like you, she said. You claim to be objective, but you push your own agenda. Your questions are actually accusations. You pretend to be seeking truth, but you're just looking for gotcha moments. This time, Anderson stood up, but slowly, without any sign of aggression. I've been doing this for 30 years, he said calmly. Then he began listing his experience. I've spoken to people who survived genocide. I've interviewed parents who lost their children. I've sat across from dictators, and from their victims. Then he delivered the comparison. And almost all of them, even the worst individuals, were able to face difficult questions without treating them as personal attacks. He looked directly at her. Tonight, you've treated every question as if I'm your enemy. Then, more softly. And I'm not. A brief pause. I was genuinely interested in understanding your life, your choices, your perspective. Then a direct conclusion. But you've made that impossible, because every question becomes an attack in your mind. Meghan responded quickly. Because they are attacks. Anderson shook his head slightly. No, he said. Then he gave examples. Asking how you feel about California is not an attack. Asking about your projects is not an attack. Asking for specifics about serious claims is not an attack. Then he added. These are the most basic follow-up questions any journalist would ask. Meghan's voice rose. You don't understand what I've been through. Anderson replied immediately. Then help me understand. That's why we're here. Then he clarified. But understanding requires answers, not deflection. It requires specifics, not general statements. It requires engagement, not hostility. Meghan insisted. I am engaging. Anderson corrected her. You're defending. Then he explained the difference. Engagement means listening to the question and responding thoughtfully. Defense means treating every question like a threat and trying to shut it down. Then the key observation. You've been defensive since the moment you walked in. That was the breaking point. Meghan picked up her purse. Her movements were controlled, but the anger was obvious. I'm leaving, she said. This interview is over. Anderson nodded slowly. That's your choice, he said calmly. Then he added. But before you go, I'd like to say something. Meghan stopped. She didn't turn fully, but she didn't leave either. And that pause set the stage for the most powerful moment of the entire interview. Anderson's voice carried that calm, quiet intensity that had made him one of the most respected journalists in America. "I've interviewed people accused of war crimes who stayed until the very end," he said. "I've talked to politicians caught in scandals who answered every question. I've sat across from people in far worse situations than yours who engaged honestly and completely." He paused briefly, letting the words sink in. "You're leaving because I asked you to explain your own public statements," he continued. "Think about what that says." Then he added the crucial insight. "It says you're unwilling to participate when someone actually examines your story. Your story works in controlled environments, Netflix documentaries, Oprah interviews with soft questions, podcasts you host yourself. But it doesn't work when someone asks follow-up questions." He looked directly at her. "That's not my failure," he said. "That's the failure of the story itself." Meghan's face contorted with barely concealed anger. "My story is true," she said. "Parts of it may be. But stories that are fully true don't fall apart under basic questioning. They become stronger when examined." Anderson nodded slowly, listening. "Yours doesn't," he said. "It becomes vaguer. More defensive. More dependent on accusations of hostility." He leaned forward slightly. "That's not the behavior of truth. That's the behavior of a narrative." "You're calling me a liar," Meghan shot back. "I'm calling you evasive. Defensive. Unwilling to engage with straightforward questions about your own claims." He paused. "If that means liar to you, that's your interpretation," he said calmly. "It's not my accusation." Meghan stood frozen in the doorway, caught between leaving and making one last statement. "History will vindicate me," she said. Anderson smiled, but it was a sad, reflective smile. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe history will see someone who had extraordinary opportunities and spent much of her time focusing on grievances. Someone who could have used her platform for almost anything, and chose to use it mostly to complain." He paused briefly. "Someone who had everything, and still felt wronged." Then he added softly, "I hope I'm wrong. I hope you find peace. But peace isn't found by arguing with everyone who sees you clearly. At some point, you have to consider that perhaps the people noticing contradictions aren't the problem." Meghan opened her mouth to respond, then paused. She seemed to realize she had nothing left to say. Finally, she turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a decisive click. Anderson sat for a moment in silence. The camera continued rolling. Then he turned slowly to the lens, expression weary but composed. "Well," he said. "That was unexpected. In all my years of interviewing, I've rarely had a subject walk out before we finished." He continued. "I've interviewed people accused of terrible crimes, and they stayed until the end. I've talked to politicians in crisis, and they answered every question. A duchess leaving because I asked about her projects and her racism claims, that's a first." He paused to gather his thoughts. "I want to be clear about what happened here. I asked basic questions. How are you? How are your projects going? Can you be specific about your claims? These are questions I would ask any subject who has made their personal life the center of their public story." He continued. "Meghan has spent years talking about her experiences, her struggles, her perspective. And tonight, when I asked her to engage seriously, she couldn't." Anderson shook his head slowly. "That's not my failure," he said. "That's hers. And on some level, I think she knows it." He leaned back slightly, expression reflective. "The anger. The defensiveness. The accusations of unfairness, those are the responses of someone who built a narrative that cannot survive scrutiny." He paused briefly. "I didn't expose anything tonight. I just asked questions." She exposed herself, through how she responded. Anderson checked his watch briefly. The interview lasted 24 minutes before she walked out. Its impact will last far longer. He leaned slightly toward the camera. For Anderson Cooper, it was another example of what happens when someone who's never faced real questioning finally encounters it. The pattern was familiar, defensiveness. But the surprise was how quickly she left. For Meghan Markle, it was something else entirely. It was a moment captured on camera, proof that her carefully constructed narrative cannot survive basic journalistic inquiry. He gestured subtly toward the studio, as if showing the audience the significance. The 60-minute stopwatch has ticked for over 50 years, covering segments that changed history, exposed corruption, and revealed truth. He paused, voice quieter but steady. On this Sunday, it marked something simpler, but no less significant. The moment a duchess discovered that some questions don't care about titles, and some journalists don't care about walking out. Anderson leaned back, expression weary, voice measured. "What do you think? Was I too persistent, or did she deserve every question? Who would you like to see on 60 Minutes next?" He looked directly at the camera, inviting the audience. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, like this video to help it reach more people. And subscribe for more explosive celebrity moments. The camera held the frame for a final beat. Then the screen faded, leaving the audience to digest what had just unfolded.